In this video, I want to connect to a MySQL database using Node. So in the previous video, we started to create a MVC CRUD application. So if I do a node on the index file, where we got to was we could go to a URL, localhost 3000, and we'll get served some data groceries. At the moment, we have our routes, so the user will go to a particular route, and then if they go to /grocery, the index.js file will handle this. It will see the route groceries. It will call the grocery routes, and this grocery routes, it will call the grocery controller to get all the groceries, and inside the grocery controller that's where we fetch all the data, and the data is coming from the model, and in this case we've just hard-coded fetch all method on the grocery class, a static method. Now what we'd like to do in this video is get some real data, and more specifically connect to a MySQL database to retrieve this data. So if you haven't already installed MySQL, make sure you watch a previous video on how to do that. So here is MySQL Workbench. So go ahead and just log on to that, and I'll just enter my password here. And it will take you to this interface here. Now what we'll do is we'll just create a table, and we'll create a schema just by right clicking in this left pane here and creating a schema, and we'll just call this database groceries, and we can click apply, and that will just execute this SQL query to create the schema groceries. So we can just apply that. Now we have this database here. We need to create a table, and I'll also call this groceries. And this will consist of two fields, just the ID, which will be our primary key and not null, and we'll make it auto increment. And we can also have our item here, and we'll make that a varchar of say 255. That's not null as well, and we'll just go ahead and apply, and then this will create this table groceries in the schema groceries with the primary key, which is not null, auto increments, and our item, the grocery itself, is a varchar 255, not null. So now that we've created that table there, let's just go ahead and take a look at it. So let's take a look at our click this button here, and let's just add a bit of data to it. So ID, let's say bread, and 2, that can be milk, and I'll just add these rows here. And of course you can add the SQL queries in this part here, but I'll just keep it simple. We'll insert those, and now if we select all of them, we get these two back, or if we wanted to select one where the ID is 1, you can just add this SQL query here like that, and you just get back that 1. I'll just make this getting all of our data from the database, and this will be the first SQL query we want to connect to our API. So how can we do that? Well, let's just go ahead and well, firstly let's install NodeMon, because every time we've been making a change we have to call this node index.js command. So rather than do that, we can just do a npm install, and we'll install it as a developer dependency because it doesn't relate to our project. And okay, so we'll just wait for that to install, and once it's installed you can see it in the dev dependencies here. So we can just change this script here to start, so we can run npm start, and we can call the command node-mon index.js. So this will just continuously watch for changes. So if I run an npm start, we can see, we can retrieve our data, and if I make a change to one, let's say change this to 3, and we reload, now we can see that we got changed to 3. So yeah, it's just sort of continually watching us. But I want to install another package, so I'll just cancel out of that. I also want to install MySQL 2, which is the latest version. And I also want to download or install something called body parser, and that will allow us to parse JSON data. And we'll see that in a moment. So let's just go ahead and install those. And this should be added to our package JSON here. Yep. So we've got body parser express MySQL. So we can just go ahead and close that now. And okay, so what we'll do is we'll connect to our database. And to do that, I'm going to create 2 folders here. I'm going to create one called config, and inside that I'll have a new file called config.json, and this will be this is the configuration file for our MySQL database, and the host and username and password. So this is a typical way to connect to the database, is we need to provide the details, and the client shouldn't, well, the client, it's safe to type your password in here and the host and all that, and the host we will use is localhost, because we're just in development mode. If you're deploying that, you just change that to the server that you're on. So the user is root in my case, and that's just the default username in when you install MySQL. Now the database, that's just what we created just then. So I created this database here, groceries. So I'm going to connect to this groceries database, and finally you can put in your password here, and I'll just type in password here, and you can go ahead and save the file, and I'll close that file, and I'll close these other files too, and just collapse these folders here. So we can see that we've got the config folder which is just the JSON object, and we can create another folder here called database. Oh, well, let's call it util for our utilities, and this utility that we want in particular is going to be our database. So we'll just create a JavaScript file called database, and we're going to need that MySQL package that we installed. So let's just create a constant variable MySQL, and we can use the require syntax to require from the node module MySQL 2. And we're going to need those credentials, and the reason I put them in a separate folder is just to add one extra layer of security, even though these node files aren't accessible by the client. Just an extra security measure. So I'll just call in that configuration file. So I'll create a variable config, and I'll require in from Docker directory in that config folder the config.json file. So now what we're doing in a API is we have a server that's constantly serving requests back. So we're giving data back from the database, or posting data to the database, or editing it, or deleting it, or something along those lines. So rather than connect to the MySQL database each time we have a query, it's likely the user's going to make multiple ones. Like they're going to go get the page, they're going to fetch data, post data. So it's better to create a pool, and a pool is essentially, it's just a connection with MySQL. And there's some extra details in there, but just for simplicity, we'll create the connection to the pool with this MySQL create pool method that comes with that package there. And we can just go ahead and just type in our details. So we can just say host, and that's the host we typed in before, so that's local host. And you could type it in here, and there's nothing really too wrong with that. It's just, as I mentioned before, just slightly better just to have that separation there, the extra separation. So I'll just call that JSON object like that. I define the variable config, and then I'm accessing it through object notation, so .host. And the same thing will apply to the user, the database, and the password. So we can just go ahead and just say, so I might use multiple cursors here. Just copy that. And for the config dot that, and I'll put a comma there. So that's how we create our connection to MySQL. And these are the 4 things you need: the host, local server, the user, root, the database name, whatever you named it, in our case groceries, and the password, whatever that is for you. And we just need to export this because we're going to need to access this pool when we do our queries, so our SQL statements. And we can do this by calling this promise method on pool and just exporting that like that. So, okay. So now we want to change our models. So recall the models is where our data is, or we retrieve our data. And we currently have this static fetch all method. Now we want to still have a static method, but we want to interact with the database. So let's just create this variable db to represent the database, and we can require that connection pool that we just created in the util folder, that database file. So we can just go ahead and close that, and all we have to do is change this query here. So rather than the hard-coded data, we can just return. So we need to access the database pool, so we call that db, and then this has a method called execute, which will execute a SQL query. And in this case, we'll just select star, so selecting everything from groceries. And we've sort of seen this in action before, where we're just inserting all the rows from this groceries table here to get these ID 1 and 2 with bread and milk respectively. It should be noted that we shouldn't allow any, like when they make a post request or something like that, there's a special way to handle that, so there's no interruption. So they, people can't do anything with our database or anything like that. But we'll see that in the next video when we cover all of the CRUD operations, how to escape that. So just for now, that's the query that we got. Now, this is the data, and recall that with the data we need to interact with our the route that we requested, and to do that we can do that through a controller. So the MVC pattern is all about connecting to a view through a controller to the data. So the model's the data, and we connect to a view and put that data in the view through a controller. In a case of an API, the view part is a route. So we're accessing a route and we're getting data back, and that's independent of the application. So we'll need to set up that, but we'll just do the groceries controller for now. So, okay. The fetch all method's still there, but what we're going to do is we need to access it asynchronously. We need to call this fetch method, and this fetch method that executes on the database happens asynchronously. So we need to await that sort of response. So I might make this function async just by putting the async keyword before the request response next parameters in this arrow function. And just like normal requests, asynchronous requests, you know, it's either going to work or it's not going to work. So what we can do is we can do a try catch block to handle any of, you know, the errors that occur. But what we want to do is we want to await the grocery dot fetch all, and because we need to await for that, we can assign that to a variable. So we're waiting for the SQL query to execute and get all of the groceries from the grocery database. So let's just say constant or groceries, and in the current form that it's in, we're going to want to set up some JSON. We want all our data to be in the JSON format. So one thing we might want to set up with the body parser is that, and we'll do that in just a moment, but we want to use some destructuring so that we don't return an array with JSON data in it. We just want the JSON data. So we can just use this destructuring syntax, which will create the variable all groceries. So I'm sure you're familiar with destructuring, but what the data we're expecting back is of the JSON format, and there's an extra set of brackets there. So we want to assign the JSON variable without the outer one, out of brackets. So that's why we take it out like that. And if that's not clear, we'll see the result in just a moment. So we take the response and we want to say, okay, in the case that it's all good, we want to say, okay, that's a 200. So we assign it a 200 status code, and we also want it in the JSON format. So we can just take that data that we've destructured and then have it in JSON format. So we can just do that like that. Now we want to catch any errors that occur. So we can catch the errors, and we can just say if there's no error status code, we can assign one. So you might get a 404 or a 500. So 404 is a page not found, and a 500 is a server error. So let's just say our server's not working, and we can assign a status code of 500. And this is just the status code. We actually want a separate controller to handle an error. And with the node sort of, we got the request, we got the response, but we can also call this next function. And this next is sort of like a middleware that can be used. So for example, if we have this error here like this, and inside this catch block, so an error occurred. We've set a status code if one hasn't existed already, but we can actually handle more specifically the error case by sending it to a error handler function. And this next, with this error here, this will get sent to a error controller that we define in the index. We define it in the controller, but we call that route from the index. So in this controllers folder, we can create a file called error.js, and this is where we want to export a few two different cases. Let's do two different cases. So we'll export the case that they get a 404, and this is the typical request response next signature, and I'll just copy that sort of format here in the case that we get a 500, so a server error. And the server error, we will allow okay, let's just do the 404 first. We'll do the 404 first. So let's say they come to the index page. Well, they don't actually come to the index page, but let's say they type in a URL and it doesn't reach this /groceries section. So there's two things that could occur in our two cases. One is that the page is not found, or one is that there's an error in the server. So we'll handle the case that the page is not found, and we can do this by calling our error controller, and we need to bring that in to call that. So let's bring that in just below the grocery routes. So we can require a controller from the controllers folder from the error.js file, and if the endpoint doesn't reach the path /groceries, then we can say, okay, the page doesn't exist, or the route doesn't exist. I'm using the API and the MVC sort of language interchangeably here, but there is that distinguishment between the route and the view. So what we can do is we can just say, okay, we got the error controller. We can just say, we can just use, and we don't have to specify the route here. You can just say use controller.get 404, and I'm anticipating we'll handle the 500 one as well. So we can just say use error controller get 500. So first we want to detect if there's a the route's not found. You know, maybe that's not the error and it is a server error. So then after we'll handle that case by calling the get 500 error here. Okay, so in our get 404 error handling middleware, we can say, okay, we need to say there's some sort of error, so we'll assign that to a variable called error, and this is a new error, and we'll just say not found. And we can give that a status of, say, 404, and we can also call the next function to check that it's not a 500 error. So we can just say next error, and this will automatically go to the next one because in our index.js we're using this 404. There's nothing really else to do except to go for this 500, and we'll make this 500 take an extra parameter, and we'll call this error here. So that means this next error can be an input in here, and this is done so we can check that it's not a server error. So, and it should be noted, you know, we might not reach this 404 page because we might reach a route, but there might be some sort of other error. So that other error could get passed to this 500 as well. So it's not just this one here what's been explicitly called. Node does this next error thing sort of behind the scenes, and so we'll just handle the cases of other errors and this error that we've explicitly defined. So that's why here I'm going to say the status is whatever the error status is, and that's not necessarily a 404, although in this explanation it's been a 404. But if that's not there, we can say, okay, well, you know, it's a 500 error. And we want our responses in JSON, so let's just say the response in JSON is this object here, and it's an error object, which is an object itself, and it's going to have a message and an error message associated with that. And again, the error message has that detail there handled for us, so we can save that. And now we have our error handling. So just a brief recap: the user makes a request. Let's say they make a request to groceries, and we execute a command to get all the data from the database. If for whatever reason it fails, we can handle that through our controller by catching any errors and calling this error middleware. This error middleware, we've created two, one for the 404 case, which happens before the 500 case. And it should be noted that this sort of filters down. So if you had two routes that were, you know, let's say you had, you know, a request to slash and then another one to slash groceries, where slash is just, you know, www.website.com. You know, the more specific ones, it's better to have them up the top, because if it goes into the first one and then it gets handled there somehow, then, you know, that can cause some problems where it's not handled correctly. So, but in this case, we've sent it to another route section in grocery routes. So anyway, the errors get handled if there are any, and our get request is almost working, but we do need to set up the ability to have that JSON data go through. So recall that earlier we installed the body parser package. Well, we need to create a variable, and I'll call it body parser, and we can require body parser, and we need to create some middleware here. Well, this is middleware that, you know, so our request sort of goes down the chain of you know, our these are what we're importing here, and then, you know, our request will hit this route, and if it doesn't hit this route, it goes to the next one. So we can intercept that, and we, on our application that we use by using Express, we can have this body parser.json, and this will pass all our requests into the JSON format, and, you know, when we retrieve and all that sort of stuff, data and post data and stuff, the expected format will be in JSON. So we get the request, and if the body's expected to be in JSON, you know, if it has a body, and then it goes down the line here. Now, one thing we want to do is we want to also create some headers. So we can use our typical request, response, and next parameters, and we need to, so the headers we want to set, so there's this issue of CORS or cross-origin resource sharing, and this occurs when you have an API and it's coming from a different website, or it's hosted on a different server than your current website. So you've got your front end and you've got your back end, and let's say your front end was on, www.website1.com, and then your API is on www.website2.com. Well, there's this security issue with that, and we're just doing development. So the case that we're going to have is we're going to have an API that's on localhost 3000, and we're going to have a front end application, like an Angular application, on localhost 4200. So we don't want that. So we need to set a custom header here, and we can do that with the response by setting a header. And there's this one called access control allow origin, and it's all uppercase first letters separated by a hyphen. And what we're going to do here is we're going to type in a star. So that means anyone can access this. Now obviously if you deployed this, you wouldn't want this to be the case. You might want one, or one other sort of website if it's not on the same server, and you might just type in website2.com, or we could even type in localhost 4200 here, but because I haven't created that yet, I'm just going to allow anything to, and it's just a CRUD application as well, so we're not taking it too seriously here. But if you're deploying, you might want to look into that a bit more. Now another header we want to add is we want to control what request we can make. So there's this one called access control allow methods, and these are just you get, you put, you post, you delete. So I might just add those. You could have star here as well, but I'm just going to do the CRUD operations. And I don't think you have to specify this, but you may as well if you're already making requests. It's probably good for other reasons as well. And we also have a header, and there's a whole bunch of headers. I think there's a whole list of them on probably on a node, or even just general web sort of development website. So another last one is we want to allow the headers, the type of the headers. So these are the allow methods header, the control allow origin header, and then the actual header, so like the content type. So we want content type to be allowed header. So we can say access control allow headers, and we want content type, and we may later change this to have authorization or something like that, so I'll just chuck that in there. And this is a custom middleware that we've created, so we need to go to the next function or the next endpoint or whatever that is, and we need to just call next on it. Now we didn't have to do this for this body pass one because it's built into the third party, well, body pass that's pretty commonly used, and that's sort of built in, so then this automatically goes to the next one. But because we made this ourselves, we have this specific next that we need to call, so it'll check if it's in the groceries routes and so on. So now that we've set up our index file, I guess we can go ahead and test this out. So let's do a npm start. And okay, so this was from before. Now if I do it now, I get the data 1 bread, 2 milk. Now let's just add another one in here. So let's just say 3, what's something else, corn. And I add this to our database and finish that. Now we can see that if we go back to the endpoint and we call this API get request, we'll get all of that data back, and now we get this item 3 corn. Okay, so just to recap what we've done here, I might just close all the files as well. We created a connection to a database, and we made a pool so we can constantly connect to the database and make a request. We actually made our MySQL database with just a list basically of ID and items. Then what we did after we connected by having our host, the user, the database and the password, we allowed our data to be retrieved by executing a method by connecting to the database pool and doing an SQL query to select all of the data from the groceries. And to do that, we had to have a certain controller, and this controller was in a try-catch block, and it was async await because we had to wait for the data to come back, and then we gave it a 200 status to say if it's all good, or we said, okay, you know, it's not all good, let's assign it a 500, and we'll call our error controller. Then our error controller or controllers are either going to be a 404 or 500, and then it's going to have the error message associated with it if something goes wrong. And what else did we do? And so we also set up our index file, so you know, we have all of our packages that we need. So we use Express and Body Parser in particular. You know, we created the nodemon script, which is just a dev dependency because we don't need it for our server, and then obviously the MySQL 2 package. And then we set up our sort of MVC get application to get the groceries by having this middleware to pass JSON data, add a few headers for access control purposes, handle the routes, and listen for requests. So in the next video, what we'll do is we'll implement the post, put, and delete methods. So we'll have a complete MySQL node CRUD MVC application, and then after that we'll connect it to a front end like Angular, and it should be known that you can connect it to any client you want. It's independent of the framework. There's that separation between the database and the back end and the front end, so because it's not server-side rendered or anything. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.